Margareta, thank you so much for joining us. I just want to kick off by asking you what your expectations are for this conference here in Hanoi.
Well, it's an interesting conference in that it clearly brings together researchers, practitioners, government officials, you and everyone. So, and it's focused on communication, which is maybe in this context another word for how do you learn most rapidly from the most practically available experience, and how do you overcome the gap between the central, the local, the global, the regional. So that's really what I hope, that very practical, transferable, in a language that can be used by all of us, experiences can break down some of these barriers. That the main effect of these barriers on communication is slowing down very important learning, and we have very little time to get ahead of some of the very negative trends.
And where do you see the intersection between disaster risk reduction, which of course is where you specialise, and community-based adaptation?
In fact, the most effective disaster risk reduction is done at the community. That's where, because the most costly disasters, it's hard to believe when you watch TV and you see what's happening in Japan and New Zealand and Bangkok. But the disasters that really take a cut out of development investments, the ones that really have the strongest link to poverty, are the daily disasters that people suffer. Annual flooding 2-3 times, take one house, one school, 6 kilometers of road. And I'm sure that most of the unaccounted for disaster losses are in this domain. So not investing in communities and the community-based disaster risk reduction will lead to that we cannot get ahead of this negative trend. And it will ensure that any aspiration or dream of a sustainable and equitable development framework will not be feasible to achieve. It will be far too optimistic.
And do you think this is recognised by mainstream policymakers? Is this something that's already on their agenda?
Of course it's recognised in theory, but I don't think that the most people that take big policy decisions are very closely connected to communities, and I can see why. Communities do not have their own voice. They are very often heard through intermediaries. And in fact, that's sort of one of the things that we really would like to try to contribute to, is to ensure that communities speak. They know, they are the best ones to identify the problem. What they very often these days need to benefit from is how to first adapt and then mitigate for the problem to find longer-term solutions. And I've met strong communities that have gone through serious disaster issues. They've recovered well, and when you ask them what's the big challenge, is there anything we can do for you, they ask how can we impact the policy making in our government. So how to remove the intermediaries and actually trust and be comfortable hearing what people say, what advices are, is critical.
Has there been any progress in giving these communities a voice and giving them agency, and what kinds of approaches are proving successful?
There are, of course, one, I think there's from both sides. I'm sure there's much more sensitivity. I think the program here in Vietnam, that I don't know if you had a chance to see it, is one way of doing it. It's a concerted effort to strengthen the community-based risk management. In the climate work as well, much more attention to how people, particularly living in rural areas, how the weather variability impacts their livelihoods. That's been one way of really quantifying the economic impact of climate change. And forums like this, but also community organizations, NGOs, researchers, it's like with all information, if there is too much and it's not really synthesized at various levels of the system, it's very difficult to turn it into actionable policy recommendation. So what we need more of, and I think many of the organizations that are here can assist with that is to draw on all this, synthesize and say what's viable, what's transferable, what works here doesn't necessarily work there, but here's a few things that work. And that's what I would like to see a lot more.
Margareta Wahlström, thank you very much for speaking to us.